So last week we met Jesus as he crossed over the Sea of Galilee into Gentile territory to engage a man possessed by an evil spirit called Legion. And the man moves from erratic and out of control to seated, clothed, and in his right mind. And this picture of transformation was then equated with both spiritual transformation and also this picture of Jesus standing against systems of oppression. And Jesus seems to declare that despite the evil that surrounds us, that occurs near us or tries to destroy us, we can remain confident because he is stronger. The rest of chapter 5 tells the story of the woman with the issue of blood and then the healing of Jairus' daughter. And then we come into chapter 6, Jesus goes home and they say, "Who are you?" And then he sends out his disciples onto this ministry journey where they go in twos into surrounding communities. They're to go with no food, no money, and no provisions. And they're simply supposed to kind of rely on God and rely on the people that they're encountering. And it's at this point that we then learn about, this is the fast track of Mark. So this is when we learn about John the Baptist's violent death at the hands of King Herod. And while Jesus is still grieving that loss, the disciples return with excitement and enthusiasm to tell Jesus all about what is happening and all that they've encountered. And so Jesus, feeling kind of the pressure of the moment and the pressure in the presence of the crowds, he insists that they go off on their own and get some rest and recuperate and get their strength. And if you see in the passage, you'll see that it says they didn't even have time to eat. But as they get in the boat and cross over to the other side, people take notice. They grab their friends and their family, and it says that they ran ahead of them to the direction that Jesus was going across. The crowds have heard about this man. They've witnessed lives transformed. They've seen situations resolved, and they're beginning to envision the systems that are holding them down crashing. And they sense that hope is among them as they anticipate that this could be the Messiah. When Jesus sees the multitudes, you may imagine that he would simply tell them to come back tomorrow, to let them know that he's tired. Instead, it says that Jesus looked out at the crowds that had literally gone around to the other side to meet him, and that he had this deep compassion on them. And it's equated to his heart being ripped out, that deep feeling of affection and heartbreak and emotion as he lays eyes on the masses. He says that he sees them like sheep without a shepherd. But a quick glance back to verse 31 reminds us that in the midst of Jesus coming and teaching and talking to them, that they still haven't eaten. So the disciples are hungry. Jesus is probably hungry. And so the disciples, with some kind of genuine concern for the crowds and for themselves, come to Jesus and whisper, perhaps it's time that we send them to go and get some food. Let them go and get something to eat. This is a practical response to a practical problem. But Jesus is not interested in demonstrating things as status quo. He's not interested in revealing to people life as they have always known it. Instead, he wants the crowds and the masses to experience the kingdom not just as this spiritual metaphor or a political uprising, but as radical good news that responds even to their physical needs. And so Jesus looks at the disciples who are hungry, who are tired, who are concerned about these people going all the way around without having eaten. And he says something that would be startling. He says, I want you to go and get them something to eat. Now let's pause for a moment, and I want you to imagine 5,000 people. I want you to imagine 5,000, and that's the minimum. And think about what that must have looked like on a crowded hillside. And if I was one of the 12, I would see and I would hear something that's impossible. And so they asked the question that I would. How do you want me to do this? With what do you want me to use to go and get enough food to feed 5,000 people? But Jesus, who has access to all of the same information as the disciples, seems unbothered by what they do not have and instead asks them to confirm what they do have. And by asking how much bread do you have? And after searching, they discover that among them are 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. Just enough, right? Just enough for 5,000 people. But Jesus insists that feeding the crowd's souls without feeding their bodies is not enough. And so he pushes the disciples to have faith enough to step out and find a way to care for the spiritual needs of the masses, and to have an equal amount of faith to find a way to care for their physical needs. And with just 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread, they proceed to feed everyone who is seated to their satisfaction with excess left over. And once again, we are reminded that the kingdom of God is near. When I read this story, the feeding of the 5,000, I get moved. Like, it brings tears to my eyes, this picture of people coming to Jesus spiritually and physically hungry and leaving spiritually and physically full. It gives us this unique picture into the mission of the church when she's at her best. When we have faith enough to consider both the spiritual and the physical hunger of those around us. It's in those moments that we can hear the outlandish whisper of God in human flesh as he compels us with these words, "You give them something to eat." And this is our grand invitation to participate in the work of the kingdom. Wright notes that if then we repeat Jesus' command, that doesn't just mean work a bit harder at famine relief, though that could certainly help. It will also mean that those who discover the living God in and through Jesus must be prepared to face up to the evil structures and powers that still dominate and control so much of God's world, and to challenge them in the name of Jesus with the power of his victory on the cross. It isn't just a matter of he did supernatural things, so we should too. It's a matter of the full achievement of Jesus, of which these strange acts were just a part and a signpost being brought to bear through prayer and faithful action on the world that still waits for the kingdom. So what does this invitation look like? Adam Gustine, in his book, Becoming a Just Church, notes that we often look to Matthew 25 when it comes to answering this question. The passage notes that faithfulness to God, apart from feeding the hungry, giving water to the thirsty, inviting the stranger in, clothing the naked, caring for the sick, and seeking justice for the prisoner, is, as Paul would say, like a resounding gong. It's empty. But that it is in our faithfulness to the very things that Jesus notes as his priorities that we find our way into the beautiful, difficult, and meaningful work of both announcing and living out the message of the kingdom. Gustine goes on to reflect on Jeremiah 29, where it says, "This is what the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of Israel, says to all the captives. He is exiled to Babylon from Jerusalem. Build homes and plan to stay. Plant gardens and eat the food they produce. Marry and have children. Then find spouses for them so that you may have grandchildren. Multiply, do not dwindle away. And work for the peace and the prosperity of the city where I have sent you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, for its welfare will determine your welfare." Gustine notes that this passage calls the people who are about to enter into exile to do so not with their eyes on returning to their former positions and regarding their former levels of power and glory, but instead the prophet notes that wherever the people are, they must consider not only what is good for themselves, but also what is good for the places where they will reside during exile. Gustine notes that this is a shift from us and them to we. Now imagine here at West Springs the beautiful shifts in the life of our church if we both viewed ourselves and operated as a part of the neighborhood. That when we considered what good could happen with this space among us as a people and because of us, that we equally saw it as a benefit to our neighbors, the surrounding businesses, community organizers. Imagine a church that has the capacity to move from being a part of the neighborhood to becoming the neighborhood church. Within Jeremiah 29, Gustine guides us through these 3 specific concepts that talk about the work of the kingdom. We've already heard about one this morning: shalom, flourishing, and transformation. Shalom is a word that means peace, and it encompasses the making of all things whole, all things as they were created to be. In Jeremiah 29, it says, "Work for the peace of the place that I have called you," which can go back to meaning work for the wholeness of the place that I have called you. This is a call to take notice of that which is not as it should be. Those things that are in need of restoration, those things that are in need of redemption. And it's here that we are called to have our eyes open and our hearts ready to participate in all things, in people, in spaces, and to see all of them made whole. What does that look like here? What does that look like in your communities? What does that look like among your work and your social circles? The passage goes on to say, work for the prosperity or the flourishing of the place where God has placed you. This agrarian term, flourishing, reminds me of like a large tree or an abounding garden, something that produces fruit. Gustine notes that when a person is truly flourishing, people take note and get excited because the fruit coming from their labor and life is more than what was expected. Human flourishing lives at the intersection of potential and abundance. He notes that a harvest is simply the seed realizing the potential that's within it. And so as we consider our circles and our neighborhood, where do we find the seeds of potential, the capacity for abundance, and what can we do to cultivate that ground, to prepare the environment to achieve the potential that is all around us, and help those around us move towards abundance? This idea of more than what was expected. So as we consider the place where we are, both as a church and as individuals, we challenge, critique, tear down, and build up the systems, structures, and policies that prevent the flourishing of all people in the places where we have been sent. We look and we listen not as an entity outside of the community, but as a part of the community so that we can cultivate the flourishing of others. It's this pursuit of wholeness and flourishing that leads to transformation, not only of ourselves, but also of the places where we are intentionally settled, committed, and connected. Seeking shalom and flourishing in the broken places of our communities is not only the measure of our faithfulness, but it is essential and first among the priorities of the Jesus community we read about in the New Testament. A byproduct of a faithful life is a realized transformation of the place, one which encompasses every corner of a society, people, culture, systems, built environment, and creation itself. This is how the church demonstrates the kingdom intentions of God. We don't establish the kingdom ourselves, but if we are for a place, to the extent that we see this kind of transformation, we've demonstrated it for people to see and touch and taste and smell. This helps us resist that problematic notion that the kingdom of God is experienced merely in abstract spiritual ways. God's intentions include the total renewal of all things. Our demonstrations of the future should seek to be equally tangible and concrete. And so as church, as a church, we have committed to, investing in children and family, caring deeply about one another, and thinking about our neighbors. But my prayer is that as we think about the good for this space, that we are simultaneously thinking about what is good for our neighbors, what is good for our friends and our loved ones and our community. That if something is good here but is bad for out there, then we walk away from it. And while I often wonder what the best way is to measure whether or not these things are actually happening or becoming more and more a part of our DNA, I think that Gustine's words kind of help us for a jumping off point when he says that transformation becomes not just what we can see, touch, taste, and smell, but what our neighbors take notice of as well. That's where I think we can begin to celebrate that shalom is emerging and flourishing and being cultivated, not just for us, but for all. and that we are following the invitation to participate in the work of Jesus, the work of the kingdom, the offering of both spiritual and physical food. But we can only do this kind of deep kingdom work focused on caring for those who make up the church and those who are adjacent to the church if we pay attention to where Jesus is. When we read the Gospels, we begin to get an idea of where we can find Jesus, where he might call us to be his hands and feet, where he would be delighted for us to sit and listen, where he longs for us to open doors and extend tables, where he's beckoning us to be light in the midst of darkness. I found that as I meet the living Christ within the written word, I am ushered into kingdom work as I take note of what Jesus is saying or doing, where he's correcting, what he's celebrating, who he's with, and why he's with them. This then becomes the means of doing the personal and collective work of pursuing a life and a heart that resembles the Jesus we read on the pages. And suddenly we're not compelled to just give them something to eat, but we can begin to create rhythms that make this not one of the things we must do, but who we are. One's committed to the pursuit of wholeness, committed to the flourishing of all and the transformation of all people in ways that are spiritual yet physical, in ways that are now and to come, polarized and unified, urgent and timeless. When we pay attention to where Jesus is, our kingdom work can no longer be based simply on our ideas of goodness, but must become this beautiful reflection of the Jesus we have come to know and identify with. Rob Bell, in his book, What is the Bible, says these words. That's the temptation, to become cynical and jaded and weary, to see all injustice and hypocrisy and abuse and exploitation and just want to give up, to see how the system is rigged and to check out. And yet there's this library of books written thousands of years ago that is unrelenting in its insistence that it matters how we respond to the world that we find ourselves in. It matters what we do. It matters what we believe. It matters how we think about our lives and the world around us. It matters how we treat each other. How do you stand up against injustice and not lose hope? How do you live with less worry and more joy? How do you forgive someone who has wronged you? What do you do when the person in power doesn't have any integrity or a moral compass? When do you take action, and when do you trust that it's all going to work out? What we see in the Bible is that we aren't alone in these questions. These are the questions people have been wrestling with for thousands of years. And on page after page after page of the writings, they never stop insisting that this struggle we call life isn't futile, hopeless, or pointless. It's divine. I'll ask the worship team to come up. Jesus said to us to give them something to eat. And then he used what was little and small, and he used it to create more than enough. The work of the kingdom is daunting. It's like feeding 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish. We never have enough. Yet the invitation to join where Jesus is, to follow his lead, to build where he is building, to cultivate where he is seeding, it never ends. And so despite the uncertainty of it all and the complexity with which we must contend, the work of the kingdom continues. And it requires you and it requires me. So remember this call to wholeness, to flourishing, to transformation, no matter what they tell you, no matter what they say. It isn't futile, it isn't hopeless or pointless, it's divine.